it's basically the status of AWIP's distributed CM. And so I think that everyone on the call should be aware that within the virtual lab and development services, the AWIPS 2 baseline is accessible to developers. So in other words, a read-only copy of the Git repository that's currently being developed by Raytheon Omaha and others within the organization is accessible. And so that's a great stride forward in that if you have no credentials, you can get to that and clone that repository and begin to do work within it. So the next logical step then is, okay, well, I have some project that I'm working on that's been approved, and I want to be able to push those changes to AWIPS. And so that's what this AWIPS distributed CM and VLab pilot is about. And so for this build, and this build meaning 14.2.1, NCEP used the virtual lab to push their changes to the Git repository, and then we were able to, or I should say Raytheon Silver Spring was able to pull those in to Dimensions, which is the operational revision control system. So what I'll touch base on quickly, I'm going to run through it quickly because we don't have a huge amount of time, but the status of the project, what the process is, next steps, and then a summary. So as I mentioned, NCO or NCEP contributed changes for 14.2.1 through the VLab. Part of this process is that for AWIPS, we're engaging and using Jarrett, which is the code review component of the virtual lab, and I'll show you, as a reminder, the slide that shows the different components in a moment. So Raytheon Omaha continues to push updates to the AWIPS 2 Git repository that we host, and but that's going to be switched in the near future so that it's automatic and it will be done by Raytheon Silver Spring. So the current status, and this is progressing, is that for 14.3.1, which has a code check-in of May, it's early to mid-May of this year, and I believe it will be, if the schedules don't change, we'll be going out to the field in the fall of this year. So late fall, early winter. So that means that other organizations other than NCEP will be able to push changes, and all the benefits that were talked about, with Shad's talk, and we've been talking about for some time in terms of visibility, accessibility. Those are great strengths of the virtual lab, and so AWIPS will be able to capitalize on those. So one of the assumptions of this process is that there's a change, and these are kind of details that probably aren't as much of interest to you all, but there has to be an approved DR or DCS in order to be able to get things checked in. So it's not that just anyone can check code in. It has to be, there are some checks and balances along the way to make sure that everything, the only things that are intended to be allowed in make it. And as is the case for all of for AWIPS 2, and that is this project, any developer can access it as long as they have no credentials. So the other thing is that these are the details too, but there's a particular port that you have to be able to access. And so we did run across some issues at certain sites where they had this port blocked, but it's not being blocked on our end. So anyway, so the different components that come into play with regard to VLab and AWIPS and contributing back is Jarrett, which is the code review, and it also serves as a gatekeeper function, meaning that only those that have been given the role have the ability to push changes to Jarrett for these for this repository. And then there's an underlying Git repository for AWIPS. Jarrett, it controls things at the branch level, so we have the ability to have branches for specific releases of AWIPs, as well as if we want to segregate things off so that we give an organization such as GSD or NCEP their own branch, so they can kind of be isolated, we can do that. And then when the code gets checked in, it goes for a review. People go in, review that code. Once it gets approved, it makes its way into the appropriate or targeted branch. And when a change is checked in for review, it kicks off a job, and it basically enforces some standards so that when people check things in, there's some accountability in terms of making sure that they are referencing a valid issue number, what we call an integration ticket. And once that's been verified, making sure that it's in the person's pending list, it's in the right Redmine project, then it's flagged, the change is flagged as being verified. And so for things to actually make it into a repo, they have to be approved at the code review level, and they also have to be verified. So, and the verification is an automated step. So that's once it's there, you can see the view within Redmine, and I can show you that as well. And then the developer, has their copy of it, so they just fetch or clone that repo, and they can continue on and do their work. So that's at a high level what's going on. So as I mentioned, we're using Redmine, which is the issue tracking, to create integration tickets. Those are basically, at a high level, they're associated with the DR or DCS. Says this new feature needs to be developed, and it's been authorized to be checked into this particular release. So as I mentioned too, we're using Jarrett to commit those changes to the appropriate release branches within that within the AWIPS2dev baseline repository. And I also touched on this too, and that there has to be that association in order to, so that the change is verified. Once they've been approved, it gets merged into the release branch, and then we make a request to Raytheon and Silver Spring to pull those changes out. So that's, I don't think you guys you really care about all these particular details, but there's, needless to say, what ends up happening is there's this full cycle. The changes make their way to Raytheon Omaha, they come back around, and they make their way back into the virtual lab. And so there are lots of details on this within a wiki, more so than this presentation, and those are readily accessible at this URL, and I've got that up as well. So we're working with others to further refine the process and improving things as needed, and so things are going well there. So let me show you. So this is the page I referenced. It's just on the wiki for the AWIPS2 builds project, and like I said, anyone that logs into our site has access to this, and so submitting code changes to AWIPS is the page. And then the repository, like I said, if you want to just look at the changes that are there, you can come in here, and then the different branches that are available, which are tied to particular releases. So development, that's what's being worked on right now in terms of at Raytheon Omaha mostly. So these are things that haven't even been assigned to a release yet. And then for the different releases, you can see like 14.2.1 is the latest release that's been designated in here. 14.3.1 will be coming up shortly. And then NCEP contributed to this branch, the 14.2.1 branch. And you can see Steve Gilbert made those commits, and he's referencing the associated integration ticket numbers. So if you were to click on that, then you would see what exactly was it that they did. So anyway, that's at a high level one of the things that we're doing and how things are working. And then in addition to this, we've got other projects that are actively working within the virtual lab on AWIPS2 code, but they're kind of isolated at this point. So in other words, they have standalone type changes that they've been working on. One of those, for example, is the tracking mediogram, which is slated for 14.3.1. So we have a project, our own project in here, and we're working on that. And we have our own set of issues associated with it. And so the process is that we have our own repository too. And so we're working within this. And then this is just, as you can see, it's a very small subset of code. It's just our code. And then that will be, we'll use this process of pushing it, these code updates into AWIPS through this process. So are there any questions or comments?
If anyone has a question, they can raise their hand using the GoToMeeting interface, or type in a question, and we should see it and can unmute you as you need. Okay, so Don. Hey Don, you should be online. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. One question we have, maybe I just missed it. What was the dimensions? Is that a tool or something you're referring to? I'm trying to.
Yeah, so similar to Redmine or Jira, there's AWIPS has been using for some time this commercial product, and it's called Dimensions, and it hosts the code as well as all of the issues, the DRs and DCSs, and it's a very expensive product, but they've been basically it's being used on for operation and maintenance of the baseline, and but the development side of the house is all switching over to Git and the virtual lab. But there had to be a connection between the two. So in other words, once the code is finally at a point where it's going to be built within for operations, it has to go into the dimension system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey Ken, this is Ken Johnson. I'm sitting in here with Don. This is all fairly interesting in terms of making code changes to the AWIPS software itself.
Right.
What do you envision? Well, do you envision any part of this, or maybe a different approach in terms of dealing with local applications?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we first spun up the virtual lab, or actually before we even went live with it, it was right around the same time that the software collaboration portal, which was done with Track, was just going into effect to ease the migration between AWIPS1 and AWIPS2 for local application migration. And so we talked with the owners or the key personnel associated with the SCP and said, do you envision, would you be opposed to moving towards the virtual lab? And they agreed that it made sense to go in that direction, but at that point in time, they'd invested a lot of time, and the VLab was just coming up, so it didn't seem like the appropriate time. Well, in the meantime, we've had requests like from NCEP and certain groups over there that are doing development very akin to local application development, but at the National Center's perspective, and they have the same sort of request, and that is they need to be able to do collaborative development, but basically at the local apps level. So it's not code that's being contributed to the baseline, but it's things that are running on the baseline after the fact of it being delivered. So it's the same sort of thing like Python scripts and GFE type smart scripts and things like that. So we're working towards coming up with a solution where they could use the virtual lab for that. Now, one of the sticky points on this is that For this to work effectively in both situations, they need to be able to, in both situations, meaning from NCEP's, the National Center's perspective, as well as the WFOs and RFCs, they need to be able to access the virtual lab from within the AWIPS network. And that, as you can imagine, because the virtual lab is accessible from any network, albeit there is LDAP, LDAPs in place in terms of authentication, we can't have a physical connection from the AWIPS network to this. But there are some technical ways of doing it, and in fact, there's a solution in place today for the SCP. But so I guess the short answer is we're working on it. We've talked with Ronla, Henry, with regard to trying to establish this connection inside of AWIPS through firewall type rules and things. So there is no physical connection, but it gives access, and it's on her list. But because of some other priorities at the moment, it's going to have to wait a couple months. But we're just starting the process of gathering people together to come up with solutions to meet these needs, because that's the direction things are going.
Yeah, part of the reason I ask is that the VLab has been partly sold, I guess you could say, on the idea that it would help with the research to operations aspect.
Right.
And I know there's been talk of some connection between the C-STAR projects and VLab and so forth, and it's been my experience that probably the majority of, if you can quantify it in some way, the research to operations activities, that those C-STAR results largely or quite often end up in the form of some sort of smart tool or local application where the science has been validated and so forth, and it's gotten, somebody's written an application and in it goes. And in part, I guess right now, those end up in the software portal there.
What's right, the SCP.
Yeah, right. And so right now, that's the means for doing this. And I guess I would like to have a way that if I've got a C-STAR project that's at the point where they've got results and somebody needs to do some coding, be it a local application, smart tool, whatever, that we have an organized way of doing that, and anybody that wants to jump in and help with the development of that, there's the ability to do so. And then we have a place where that's put so that people know that, if they want to use that, here's the, quote-unquote official version that came out of that C-STAR project, and that's there and available and supported to one degree or another for anybody to come in and use. And so I'm kind of envisioning VLab as performing that, or I guess more or less wondering if VLab can perform that kind of function.
Yeah, I have no doubt that it can do everything that you mentioned. We just need to make sure that we've got a way so that people on the inside can get to it. And that's just a technical thing that I think we can work through, a technical and policy issue that we'll need to work through, and we're trying to work through. The other is organizational, and I have no doubt that with the ability of Redmine to have sub-projects that we can organize things in such a way that the people have the visibility, because that's going to be part of the issue here too, is making sure that people are aware. And so this ties in with Shad's comments too about communication but so that people know that something's there. And that's something that we heard from NCEP too, and that is, they said, this is great, we love it, but we want one place to go. And the SCP folks, last time we talked to them, they had no problem in shifting things over here. We need to pick that up, and we have plans to pick that up again to shift it. But it's a matter of organizing it. And we talked about a grand vision where you could even potentially in the future, it'd be nice to have like versions that are made available so that they could download through the VLab that they know, yeah, this has been tested, right? So it's at multiple levels. So one, you provide the collaboration tools and the repositories to be able to do collaborative development, but then two, tying in with the other aspects, the continuous integration component too. If it's scripts and there's really no building, but there could be some sort of security checks run on the software, and that's we were talking with Ramla about that too. And that is, it sounds as though there may be some requirements down the road to run the software through some sort of security check, and so you could do that within here, and then at least you're having a better idea that what you're pulling back down is going to work the way you would intend it to.
Hey, Ken, I see Ashley Kells is on the call. Did you want to say anything on behalf of the Smart Tool folks, the SCP?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, Ken has done a wonderful job covering it. I kind of was lurking out here and stuff like that, and I was wondering what Ken was going to say. And I know, again, as Ken mentioned, we really need to, we've decided kind of in our community that we really need to sit down and work with them, meaning Ken Sparrow and the virtual lab community, and seeing what the technical things will be on moving basically the SCP into the virtual lab. But we are, as Ken said, supportive of that. I think it's a good idea. And that's really all I have to add, unless somebody else has any questions.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Ashley. Anyone have any questions for Ashley while he's unmuted? All righty. So let's see. Were there any other questions for Ken? All righty. Then I guess we're ready for our next agenda item, which is